Good morning. Shalom. I'm very happy to be here. I'm sorry that I'm not able to speak to you in Hebrew. I can understand a small amount, but not too much. So I will try to speak slowly in English and explain about the work that we've been involved in the United Nations Environmental Program. We work very closely with the World Tourism Organization and UNESCO on tourism issues. The division that has been really doing projects on the ground and working with sustainable tourism has been mostly UNEP, based in Paris. And we have developed a number of publications, web-based tools that I will be leaving here at the university, things oriented towards the consumer, others oriented towards training people, others towards academics, marine-based tourism, tourism in deserts, ways towards sustainable tourism, disaster risk reduction, tools for training hoteliers. These will all be left here, and these will all be available to you. They're also available online at our website. But what I'm going to talk about is what is sustainable tourism and how we have been developing policies from the ground up to develop policies, and then from the policies from the top down to implement them in the field, going in both directions. And we have three very important networks that have significant implications for Israel and that Israel could easily be involved in. But I want to talk first about tourism, which all of you here are involved in one way or another. And we know that tourism, when it is properly done, when it is well done, can bring strong economic benefits, foreign exchange, help develop infrastructure, cultural exchange. As the previous speakers mentioned, during the bad years in tourism, with the problems here, when tourism went down, then there were serious problems in all sectors of the economy that were related with tourism. But tourism can also produce the opposite problems. When it is poorly done, when it is done in a way that is not sustainable, it can cause local people to lose their livelihood. It can produce pollution. It can destroy cultural and environmental heritages. When it's done correctly, when tourism is sustainable, it can reduce poverty, protect natural areas, give local communities a decent standard of living. It can strengthen the overall economy of the country. And when it's poorly done, the tourists and the tourism businesses can destroy natural areas. We see this in many places. It can raise the cost of living in rural areas and make it very difficult for the local population. It can put pressure on water, energy, and infrastructure. We have cases, for example, that we know of, for example, of a golf course in the Sahara, which uses as much water resources as the entire small city nearby. It can generate large quantities of waste, sewage, and greenhouse gases. So, in the end, what tourists want is what you see in this first picture. But sometimes, all too often, this is what we give them. So, when we talk about sustainable tourism, we're talking about how to do it the right way. We want customers to be satisfied. We want to offer quality of service. We want them to be healthy and safe. And we need to talk about sustainability in the three aspects that cover what we call sustainability, which are environmental, social-cultural, and economic aspects. And the basis for this is tourists come for a reason. Tourists are traveling to see an attraction. In general, that attraction is either cultural or natural. It can be a big city, it can be a historical or archaeological site, a sacred site, it can be a beach, a mountain, a rainforest, a desert. But we have natural resources and cultural resources. If we destroy those, then the reason for the tourists to come disappears. There are people who live almost everywhere in the world, and people who live near those attractions. If they become part of the solution, if they become part and benefit from the tourist enterprises, will support those activities and will help conserve those cultural and natural resources. But if a tourist company or a government insists on imposing a tourism solution that takes away from the people who live in the area their way of making a living, their way of surviving, they're going to be enemies of that project, and natural and cultural conservation will be destroyed. And finally, tourism is a business. When we're in the tourism business, we're giving people a chance to enjoy something. They want to come, they want to have fun, they want to enjoy themselves, they want to be safe, and we want to run a business that will allow us to make a living. It doesn't matter whether it's a private business or if it's a government or a national park. If it's poorly run as a business, it will not be sustainable in time. And when I talk about sustainability, I'm sustaining this water bottle. And I have to sustain it indefinitely if it's going to be sustainable. If I don't, we lose it. So, what is sustainable tourism? I've noticed that there is often much confusion about sustainable tourism and ecotourism. So, the World Tourism Organization says that it's tourism that meets the needs of present tourists and host regions while protecting and enhancing opportunities for the future. A definition that I like better is sustainable tourism is tourism which is economically viable. It's a business. But which does not destroy the resources on which the future of tourism will depend, the physical environment and the social fabric of the host community. If tourism destroys what people are coming to visit, then it is not sustainable as a business, and the natural and cultural resources are also not sustainable. Now, we also have to be clear that when we talk about sustainable tourism, a synonym for that, a term that means the same thing as responsible tourism. But ecotourism is not sustainable tourism. Ecotourism is a niche product that is one small form of sustainable tourism. Again, the World Tourism Organization says there is a clear distinction between ecotourism and sustainable tourism. Ecotourism refers to a segment within the sustainable tourism sector, whereas sustainability principles should be applied to all tourist activities, including accommodations and projects, including conventional and alternative tourism. All kinds of tourism, every size, every scale, every place, should be sustainable, as should be all of our activities as human beings. So there's confusion. This presentation will be available to you online. I've left a more complete version that will be available to you. But to give you an idea of a definition that we use in Costa Rica for ecotourism, it is a specialized segment of sustainable or responsible tourism that supports the conservation of nature and cultural values of the destination, interprets them for the client, promotes socioeconomic improvement of the neighboring communities, sensitizes and satisfies customers in an ethical manner, has a scale and design appropriate to the surroundings, and most important, places visitors in direct and personal contact with nature and the local culture. This is ecotourism. This is a small segment, a very important segment. It's important for Israel, it's important for Costa Rica, it's not important for all destinations. Sustainability is something that should be applied to all destinations, all activities. It's very important to keep that clear because, for example, when I went onto the website of the Ministry of Israel, the Ministry of Tourism of Israel, the terms were confused. That it talked about ecotourism and sustainable tourism. The reason for the clarity, for the need for clarity, is we need conventional tourism to be sustainable, not just ecotourism, which we hope will all be sustainable. So, who are the customers for this? Who are the people we are talking to? Well, we're talking to tourists, the end consumers, tour operators, wholesale travel agencies, online travel agencies, retail travel agencies, and large purchases. For example, I work at the United Nations. At the United Nations, we have just implemented a travel purchasing policy where United Nations functionaries will have to stay in sustainable lodgings wherever those are available. And once certified sustainable lodgings are available, they will stay in certified sustainable lodging. The market impact of a large purchaser requiring that its functionaries stay in sustainable lodgings or sustainable tours or sustainable activities is very large. And we see the same large effect from large wholesale tour operators. The outbound tour operators from Europe are demanding that their suppliers, their commercialization chain, implement sustainability policies. The online travel agencies like Expedia, Travelocity, Sabre are all giving priority to sustainable businesses. Remember, we're talking about sustainable businesses, not ecotourism. They're talking about giving priority to conventional and niche businesses, conventional and ecotourism businesses that have a sustainability policy. European officials and officials from at least 2 states in the United States, Florida and California, must now stay on official business at sustainable hospitality, certified hospitality businesses. And airlines are taking into account that clients are beginning to ask about their sustainability policy. And in fact, we find from the UK, from Britain, that tourists are beginning to stop flying and use local transportation, trains, ground transportation, because of carbon emissions from airlines. There's a demand for sustainability, and there's a demand for guarantees for sustainability. Michel will talk a little bit more about this, but these are some of the tour operators in Europe who are requiring that their commercialization chain have a sustainability policy. Travel Life is part of a consortium of all European tour operators belonging to associations. Here you can see Expedia, Travelocity, Guidebooks, Lonely Planet, Photos, Travel Weekly, in the press constantly. Companies are talking about their sustainability on their websites. It is mainstream. It is not a niche. It applies to all forms of tourism, and those businesses and those governments and those policymakers, universities that are not watching the trends, that are not observant of the trends, will lose market share. So we've talked about what is sustainability. How can we make it possible? How can we make it easier? How can we make it so that businesses and policymakers understand what it is and apply it? We have to consider the scale of what we're talking about. We have small and medium tourist businesses, which are most of the industry, but there are thousands of small businesses. You see them all over here in Haifa, in Jerusalem, in Tel Aviv, scattered everywhere in Israel, the small and medium businesses. We also have the very large tourism businesses that move about 20% of the market in about 6 companies. Both of these aspects, both of these market sectors have to be addressed. They can both do tourism badly or they can do it well. They can produce negative impacts or positive impacts, and they should all become sustainability. So we've developed instruments for some of them. For consumers, we have things like the Green Passport, which is designed to be given to tourists to explain about the behavior that they should have when they're at sites. This is a UNEP instrument that's designed to be adapted in each local site to tell people how to behave. So, for example, in Brazil, there's one in Portuguese for Brazilian tourists. In Costa Rica, there's one in English for cruise ship passengers. In Ecuador, there's one in Spanish for local visitors, for local tourism, domestic tourism, to understand how to behave in national parks. For example, it would make a lot of sense, for example, for Israel to have one of these for Jerusalem, for example. Probably in English, German, and I don't know what other languages are the principal languages that of visitors here. But we also have other instruments in terms of networks. And I'm going to spend the rest of this talk talking about networks, partnerships, activities in which Israeli institutions and Israel as a national government can participate. And so we have mechanisms for businesses. We have the Tourism Sustainability Council and the Global Sustainable Tourism Criteria. Michal will be talking about these later. We have manuals, good practice manuals for businesses. We have a partnership that I'm involved in establishing through UNEP that will be established on February 2nd and 3rd, which is a global partnership for sustainable tourism with about 15 governments, 6 United Nations organizations, a number of international organizations, non-governmental organizations, and tourism business sectors will be joining it. And we have networks for investment and finance. But what we know about how to approach this in terms of market is that most tourists want sustainable activities. They would like to participate in them. They even say that they'll pay more, though we have not seen actual demonstration that they're willing to pay more. But what we find is that before tourists will select their destination based on sustainability, first, they want to make sure that they will be safe. Again, during the Intifada, you could see that when there was a perception of danger, tourists didn't come here. They want to be able to get here easily. Places that are difficult to get to, very few people go to. As you know, people can go as a tourist to the International Space Station, but it's very difficult and very, very expensive to get to. So only about 2 tourists a year go there. So Israel is a bit easier to get to than the space station, so you get considerably more tourists. But access is an important consideration. Quality of the experience is what people select in terms of the destination they're going to, but once they've selected the destination, then environmental and cultural sustainability enter into play, but only if there's acceptable value for the price paid if quality is considered. In terms of policy decisions, now I've left consumers, now I'm talking about policymakers. Tourist boards and ministers often use a criterion for determining their success, and they justify themselves to the prime minister or to the president or to their other clients in government by saying, oh, we've increased the number of visitors, but without necessarily talking about the impact of those visitors. What we've discovered is that it's much more important the income produced and the distribution of that income within the country than the number of visitors. We have found that the negative impacts are produced by the number of visitors, because every tourist consumes water, produces waste. It doesn't matter how much money they leave. But if you have fewer tourists spending more money, you have fewer negative impacts, and you have more income that can stay in the country. But again, what I say about it staying in the country is determined by the model. If it is a sustainable model, we find that leakage, the amount of money that returns to the host country, is much lower. So we find that, for example, in Costa Rica, which has a sustainable model, 43% of tourist income stays in country. In the Dominican Republic, we find that 5% stays in country. In a mass tourism destination like Cancun, 9% stays in country. Sustainable destinations, and Israel in general does a reasonably good job of that, tend to retain a far larger proportion of their income. Finally, for investment, we see that investment is usually investment in tourism has been traditionally based on return on investment and internal rate of return. It does not consider environmental and social aspects. It considers them as externalities. However, these are the aspects that determine long-term viability, sustainability, and so the efforts that we're working on are towards making these aspects that I've just mentioned for consumers, for policymakers, for investment and finance, making them part of the model for tourism. So this is a little bit about how we do it in Costa Rica. Costa Rica is in Central America. It's between the Caribbean and the Pacific Oceans. Has good socioeconomic covers, but it had serious environmental problems of deforestation, which have been turned around, and we now have a large number of protected areas. And because of tourism, conservation has been strengthened. These are some of the things that you'll see. This is an adventure activity. We also have beaches and coasts. And we have, at this point, about 20% of foreign exchange and about 5% of it's about 20 to 25% of foreign exchange in Costa Rica comes from tourism. About 5 to 8% of gross internal product, gross domestic product. Thank you. But this is something where what we do in Costa Rica is similar to what you can do in Israel and what you have been doing in Israel. These are the activities that a tourist does. The total percentage of activities, on the left, sun and beach. We have also nature, trail walking, but we also have conventional tourism. The total is 463%. That means that each visitor, on average, is doing 4 to 5 different activities. They're complementary. We have sun and beach, city, cruise ships, nature-based tourism. These are from my business, my lodge. We have adventure tourism of different types. We have community-based ecotourism. And what we find is that with all of these, sustainability, sustainable tourism is part of each of these. Ecotourism is about 66% of our visitors engage in ecotourism, 13% in cultural tourism. I would imagine in Israel those figures would be reversed, where cultural tourism would be the largest. City tourism and beach tourism is quite important there. But what we find is that these activities feed on each other. They strengthen each other. That people stay more days, they spend more time in Costa Rica because they have these complementary activities. And our goal in Costa Rica is that all of these activities will become sustainable at all levels. So we market it, and this is what I mentioned about leakage. This is an interesting figure. You see France on the left in terms of number of visitors. France is the world's largest destination in terms of visitors, but look at revenue per visitors. Israel makes twice as much income per visitor than France. Israel is doing a good job in obtaining and retaining income from tourists. Costa Rica also does a good job. France, surprisingly, although it has a large number of visitors, is not doing a very good job. So these are some of the activities we're working on. These are our projects, which I don't really have time to go into, but we work on resource efficiency, investment in sustainability, and consumer choice. And we've established 3 new networks, and these are the last topic I'm going to talk about. We have the Tourism Sustainability Council, we have the Sustainable Investment and Finance in Tourism Initiative, and the Global Partnership for Sustainable Tourism. Each of these networks has relevance for Israel. The Tourism Sustainability Council is designed to bring together businesses, it's business-oriented, to offer a common understanding of sustainable tourism and the adoption of universal sustainable tourism principles and criteria. It's based on the Global Sustainable Tourism Criteria. We're developing an accreditation standard to accredit certification programs. That's only one of the activities. There are a lot more business-oriented activities that are designed to bring businesses, voluntary initiatives, these are all voluntary initiatives for businesses to become more sustainable. And businesses can become part of this network, where there are more than 50 organizations. Among the steering committee is UNEP, the United Nations Foundation, the World Tourism Organization, Expedia, Travelocity, Fairmont Hotels, Marriott Hotels, IUCN, Rainforest Alliance, Conservation International. And then we have the International Hotels and Restaurant Association with 300,000 members, the American Association of Travel Agents, Travel Life, Travel Weekly, and dozens of other members. And these are based, our work is centered around implementing as the minimum criteria the Global Sustainable Tourism Criteria, for which are the minimum that any business should do to be sustainable. Not the best, not the maximum, the minimum. Each business should do at least this, but hopefully much more, to move towards sustainability. And you'll hear a lot more about this in another talk from Michel shortly. The Sustainable Investment in Tourism Network is designed to get financial institutions, private and public, multilateral and commercial, in developed countries and developing countries, to stop financing unsustainable projects and finance sustainable tourism projects. So we expect to be doing this, or we are doing this, by establishing guidelines and benchmarking mechanisms, voluntary initiatives, trying to, again, do an emphasis on making sure that sustainable businesses in developing countries have access, but this applies to all countries, doing research and capacity building and information and coordination, so that we bring together financial institutions. We're at this stage right now. We're developing a common standard which is based on the Global Sustainable Tourism Criteria. It's being implemented by the Inter-American Development Bank, which developed an instrument that, along with the Equator Principles, we expect to be adopted by commercial banks around the world, which means that commercial projects and commercial banks in Israel will eventually probably adopt these criteria in order to determine which projects they finance. That means that businesses that are not sustainable environmentally or socially are not likely to be able to receive financing in the future. And then finally, to make sure that we can do a good match so that those projects that are already sustainable will be able to find investment. So we're developing the guidelines, we're developing benchmarking mechanisms which incorporate the externalities that I mentioned, the social and environmental and cultural externalities being incorporated into a financial instrument and voluntary initiatives. And then finally, on a policy level, for the government of Israel, other governments, we're developing a global partnership on sustainable tourism that's designed to make sustainability part of tourism policies, development, and operations. And this will be launched on February 2nd in Paris. And these are some of the partners. There are UN agencies, governments, international organizations, intergovernmental organizations, major groups, and other agencies. Israel is not on this list, but all that would be required would be for the Ministry of Tourism to request to join this and to offer something in return. So the activities are implementing policy recommendations, taking successful projects from anywhere in the world, successful sustainable tourism projects from anywhere in the world, and implementing them, scaling them up, adapting them, and implementing them in other regions, developing new tools, and building new partnerships and networks like the ones that I've just described. We're working on policy frameworks, climate change, poverty, natural and cultural heritage, including biodiversity protection, helping the private sector, and in finance and investment. And we will be able to launch, replicate, and scale up projects from one part of the world into any other part of the world. And toda raba.